My name is Rick Browning. I'm a union carpenter out of Local 808 in Idaho Falls, Idaho. I work at a Wind River Job Corps in Riverton, Wyoming, lead instructor. And today I want to go over some safety tips on using a circular saw. Circular saw is probably one of the most used tools, power tools, in the construction industry as far as industrial construction. So we're going to go over, first of all, the thing you need to know is some of the names and what some of the things are called on the saw. So of course you have the blade, you have the arbor that holds the blade on, the arbor lock nut. You have the base of the saw. Some people call this the shoe, some people call it the foot, but it's basically the base. You have a guard on the top of the saw blade, and you also have a retractable guard at the bottom that retracts when you're cutting the wood. You also, on the base, you have an adjustment, a depth adjustment to go up and down. So they call that the depth adjustment. Then you have, if you're cutting a bevel angle, you have a bevel angle lock. And you can angle the base to a 45-degree angle. This particular one goes up more than a 45, but you can put any angle on there you want. So, of course you got the handle, you got the trigger in here. Some people wind their cords up. I normally just fold mine up. Everybody has a different way of doing things, of course, but I fold mine up and put it right in the handle. As far as the safety goes, as you notice, I'm messing with the saw, but I do not have it plugged in. You never mess with the saw adjustments, adjusting the blade, taking the blade off. You always keep it unplugged until you're actually going to use the saw. A lot of people, they'll keep their finger right here. I try not to do that. I try to just hold it like this and keep my hand or finger off that trigger until I'm ready to actually saw. That's a pretty good tip, I think. Another tip is when you are using a circular saw, you want to know what kind of material how thick the material is that you're sawing. So if I was going to cut 3/4 inch plywood, you only want to go like 1/4 of an inch below the material. Setting it too deep, if it goes too deep, it will cause the saw to kick back on you. Kickback is when it kicks back like this. It will have a tendency to kick back if you're too deep. Also, it's just harder on the blade because the blade is going through more than what you actually want it to go through. So you always want to set it, and on this particular saw, every saw has usually a gauge, but it will kind of tell you what it has. 2x4 material, which would be a 2x4. Then you have 3/4 inch material or 1x material. So you just adjust it to that setting, and then you tighten this up, tighten the lever up. To get back to when you're first going to use a saw, if you've never really used that saw before, it's best to take a look at it after you know what the parts are, and just kind of look at it and make sure that you see that all the screws, all the bolts are in there. Everything is where it needs to be. You can usually tell if there's something missing because with the vibration and a lot of use of this saw, it will want to, the bolts will want to come out. So it's best to ever so often check them to find out, to make sure that they are not, loose and wobbling out of there. The other thing you want to check is the cord, of course, to make sure that there's no nicks and cuts in the cord. Of course, you always want to make sure that there's the ground plugs on there, definitely, and the prongs are correct and looking good. They get wore out pretty quick, and if that happens, you want to get somebody that knows about electrical to change the cord for you. These can be changed. We're going to talk about, that would be the first thing. Of course, you want to wear safety glasses. You probably want to wear gloves, especially when you're working with wood, because if you're working with wood, you're probably going to get splinters. So it's good to be wearing gloves. I'm not really going to cut anything right now, so I'm not wearing gloves. So a few tips about when you're using the saw. The best thing to do, if you're unfamiliar with the saw, the best thing to do is read the manual, and it will tell you a lot of things, the owner's manual. It will tell you a lot of the do's and don'ts about the saw. So if you're first starting out, here's a tip for someone that's not ever really used a saw before or much. I've noticed a lot of being an instructor with young students that's never used one. I've noticed that when they're going to saw, they usually put the blade right up against where they're marked, where they're going to cut, and I kind of get worried about that, because what you should always do is, if you want to line your blade up with your mark, that is fine. But you always want to turn your saw on first, then guide it to the mark. If you never want to put the blade up against the wood, then turn the saw on, because it will jam the saw and it'll kick back on you. So the other thing about circular saw that I've found is that when you're cutting a bevel, so you're cutting an angle, and especially on a 2x4, it's not really bad with a piece of plywood, but on a 2x4, most of the time you have to adjust it to 45-degree angle, and then you have to go as deep as you can with the depth adjustment, so that it will go through that 1.5 inches. So there's a lot of blade that's going through that 1.5 inches material. Well, what happens when you're doing that is that a lot of times the grain of the wood, it'll kind of condense, and it will try to compress. It all depends the grain of the wood. So as you're sawing, you're sawing through a lot of wood, and it bogs down. Basically, if you come into that situation, you just want to be aware of it when you're sawing. And what I tell everybody is that a saw will tell you when it's doing something that it does not want to do, or it's being overtaxed or overused. It will tell you just by listening to the sound of it. I would like to say that circular saws are probably, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most dangerous tools that you can use besides a table saw, mainly because it's mobile and it's easy to move around, and I think, and it can get away from you real quick. When you are using a circular saw, it's best to really pay attention, keep your mind on what you're doing, and I believe that will probably take care of all the safety tips that I can really come up with right now, and hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.